She begged him with trembling hands, her children clinging at her side. The rancher only meant to pass by, but that night would bind them all to a promise none of them could walk away from. The knock startled him out of his thoughts. Daniel Harlow had been leading his tired mare down the rutted trail when he heard it, not a knock on his door, but on a weather-beaten cabin half hidden in the cottonwoods. The sound was faint, uneven, as if struck by someone who had little strength left in them. He might have ridden on. He might have kept to his lonely path back to the ranch. But something in the brittle echo stopped him, pulled him toward that dim cabin where no light burned inside. He tied off his horse and stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft earth. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a woman's face, pale and drawn, her lips trembling as though the effort of speech might break her. "Please," her voice rasped like paper tearing. "Please take my children, I'm too sick." For a moment Daniel could only stand there, his broad frame filling the doorway, his weather-beaten face unreadable. Then his eyes shifted down and he saw them, two small figures huddled against her skirts. A boy with solemn eyes, maybe 8, holding his sister close. The girl was younger, 5 at most, her curls tangled and cheeks streaked with tears. Their little hands clutched each other like shipwrecked souls on a stormy sea. The widow swayed on her feet. Her name came to him only when she whispered it, Miriam Clay. Folks in town had spoken of her husband's death last winter, of how she tried to hold on with 2 mouths to feed and no kin nearby. But Daniel had not expected this sight, not here, not now. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white, as though her frail body might give way before he answered. Miriam's words broke into a sob. "I can't keep them safe. Please, don't let them starve." Her knees buckled, and Daniel lunged forward, catching her just before she collapsed to the floor. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. The boy, eyes wide with fear, tried to drag his sister back, but Daniel's steady voice stopped him. "I won't harm her or you." Inside the cabin, the air was cold and stale, the hearth long since gone dark. Miriam clutched his sleeve weakly, trying to say more, but her breath rattled like broken glass in her chest. Daniel lowered her gently onto the cot, the children crowding close, their faces filled with a terror far older than their years. "Your names?" Daniel asked quietly, crouching so he didn't tower above them. The boy straightened, his jaw trembling but firm. "I'm Thomas, she's Ruth." Daniel nodded slowly. Names anchored people to the world, and in this moment those names weighed heavy. He glanced at Miriam again. Her eyes, fever-bright, searched his face with a desperate plea he could not turn away from. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise you'll take them when I'm gone." Daniel's throat tightened, but he gave a single, steady nod. Miriam's trembling hand closed around his, a frail grip but fierce in its need. Only then did she allow her eyes to close, though her shallow breath still rattled through the room. The children clung to each other, their wide eyes fixed on Daniel as if he alone stood between them and the endless night outside. He had come here by chance, nothing more. Yet chance had a way of steering men where they never planned to go. He had buried too much silence on his ranch, too many nights spent with only wind for company. And now here were 2 children, their lives held out like fragile offerings, with a mother too weak to stand guard over them. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, and moved to stir the hearth. Sparks leapt weakly at first, then flared into fragile flame. The cabin filled with the faint glow of life returning, though Daniel knew the real storm was only just beginning. Miriam's fever burned hotter through the night. She drifted in and out of waking, murmuring words Daniel could barely make out. Prayers, perhaps, or fragments of memory. Sometimes she called for her husband. Sometimes she simply begged for strength enough to last until morning. Each time, Thomas tightened his grip around Ruth, his young shoulders squared as though he could bear what no child should. Daniel sat vigil by the fire, the lamplight painting harsh shadows across his weary face. His mind turned to his own past, the grave markers on his land, the echo of children's laughter that had long since been swallowed by the earth. He had not expected to feel that ache again, not tonight. Yet here it was, raw and unrelenting, pressing against the silence like a wound that refused to close. The hours dragged, heavy with breathless waiting. Then just before dawn, Miriam stirred with sudden clarity. Her eyes found Daniel's in the half-light, and her voice came sharp though frail. "Remember what I said, don't let them be alone, not in this world, swear it." Daniel leaned forward, the firelight catching in his eyes. "I swear." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, and with that, Miriam Clay released her last breath. Thomas let out a broken sound, somewhere between a cry and a gasp, and buried his face against his sister's hair. Ruth whimpered softly, too young to understand, yet knowing in her bones that something irreplaceable had been torn away. Daniel reached for the quilt at the foot of the cot, drawing it gently over Miriam's still form. He had seen death before, but the quiet weight of it never grew easier. Outside, the first light of day broke across the horizon, painting the snow-dusted fields in pale gold. Daniel stood with his hand on the doorframe, listening to the children's muffled sobs, the sound twisting something deep inside him. He had promised, and a promise was no small thing. He turned back into the room, his voice steady though it carried a heaviness that matched the earth itself. "You'll come with me now, both of you. I'll keep you safe." Thomas lifted his tear-streaked face, searching Daniel's eyes for any sign of deceit. Finding none, he gave a single, hesitant nod. Ruth clung to her brother, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Daniel gathered their few belongings, a worn doll, a patched blanket, a tin cup, and tucked them carefully into his saddlebags. Then, with the children close at his side, he stepped out into the morning air. The trail ahead was long, and he knew the whispers of town would follow him when he returned with two motherless children at his heels. But promises carried weight, heavier than any load a man could sling across a saddle. And Daniel Harlow had just bound himself to one that would change everything. The wind carried a bite that morning as Daniel guided his mare down the narrow trail with Thomas and Ruth pressed close at his side. The children clutched his coat as though letting go meant being swept away into the wilderness. Behind them, Miriam's cabin stood silent, a lonely shape against the pale winter sky. Daniel had marked the grave himself at dawn, stacking stones with quiet care while the children huddled nearby. Thomas hadn't cried. His jaw was clenched too tightly, his little hands balled into fists as though tears were a luxury he could no longer afford. Ruth had sobbed until her breath gave out, curling against her brother like a sparrow in a storm. Daniel had seen men bury wives and children before, but never had he stood as both witness and keeper of those left behind. He glanced back once, the crude marker already half lost in the snow. He would remember where it lay. He always remembered graves. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun hung low, bleeding gold across the horizon. The house loomed plain and steady at the edge of the land, its roof patched, its boards weathered, but it stood, a testament to endurance if nothing else. He reined in the mare and glanced down at Thomas, who clutched Ruth's hand tightly. "This'll be your home now," Daniel said, his voice carrying no softness yet no cruelty either. Thomas lifted his chin, his eyes dark with questions he didn't dare ask. Ruth peeked at the house, her small face pale, her lips trembling. She tugged on her brother's sleeve as if silently asking whether they would truly be safe here. Daniel dismounted, scooped Ruth into his arms without waiting for permission, and gestured for Thomas to follow. The boy hesitated, suspicion flickering in his gaze, but the weight of Ruth's small hand pulling toward Daniel's shoulder left him no choice. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and leather oil, of years lived in silence. Tools lined the wall with careful order, a rifle rested above the hearth, and a single table stood scarred by use but clean. Daniel set Ruth down near the fire, then stoked it until flames roared alive, chasing the chill from the room. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, as he laid thick quilts across the children's shoulders. "I'll bring water." Thomas obeyed, though his eyes never left Daniel's back. Ruth clung to the quilt, wide-eyed, whispering something Daniel couldn't catch. When he returned with steaming mugs, she reached for hers with trembling fingers. Daniel knelt, steadying the cup in her hands until she could drink without spilling. "Slow," he murmured, "it's hot." Her lashes fluttered as she sipped. Thomas accepted his without thanks, but Daniel didn't fault him. Gratitude took time to thaw where grief had frozen over. The hours that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Daniel showed Thomas where he could wash, set out bread and beans, and coaxed Ruth into nibbling when she pushed her food away. The children ate as if afraid it might be taken back, glancing at each other before every bite. Daniel said little, but he watched everything: the tremble in Ruth's hands, the way Thomas squared his shoulders as though he alone could shield her from the world. When the dishes were cleared, Daniel stood at the hearth, staring into the flames. He had lived with silence so long it had become part of him, but now it pressed differently. It wasn't emptiness. It was waiting, an unspoken question hanging heavy in the room. Thomas broke it at last. "Why'd you take us?" Daniel turned, meeting the boy's unflinching gaze. "Your mama asked me to." "She's dead." The words came flat, blunt. Ruth whimpered at their sharpness and buried her face against the quilt. Thomas softened instantly, wrapping his arms around her. "She's dead," he repeated quieter, "and people say things before they die they don't always mean." Daniel crouched, leveling his eyes with Thomas's. "She meant it, and I swore to her. A man don't break his word." The boy studied him long, searching for cracks. Finding none, he nodded once, though his shoulders stayed tense. "Then we'll stay, for now." Daniel almost smiled, though the weight of the promise pressed harder against him. For now. Children had a way of testing whether words were hollow or worth leaning on. He knew Thomas would test his. That night Ruth woke screaming. The storm outside had rattled the shutters, and in her dream she must have heard Miriam's last breath. She cried for her mother until her throat turned raw, her small fists striking the quilt as though striking the world itself. Daniel, heavy with sleep, pushed himself up and crossed the room. Thomas was already there, clutching her, whispering fiercely, but his own tears betrayed him. Daniel knelt beside them, uncertain. His hands, scarred from years of work, hovered in the air. Then, almost against his own nature, he lifted Ruth into his arms. She fought at first, then clung to him with surprising strength, her sobs shaking against his chest. He held her steady, murmuring low words he hadn't spoken since his own children were small, half lullaby, half prayer. Gradually, her cries softened to hiccups, then faded to sleep. Thomas stared, exhaustion carving shadows beneath his young eyes. "You got children?" he asked quietly, as if the answer mattered more than anything. Daniel didn't answer right away. He shifted Ruth gently, tucking her back beneath the quilts, and then sat with his back against the hearth. His gaze drifted to the mantel where no photographs remained, only the empty space where they had once stood. "I did," he said at last, his voice low, "long ago." The boy's face tightened, and he turned away, but Daniel caught the flicker of understanding there. Loss recognized loss, even in the young. Days turned into weeks. The routine of the ranch became their rhythm. Thomas rose early, stubbornly shadowing Daniel through chores, hauling water, feeding stock, mending fences with hands too small but fierce with determination. Ruth stayed near the hearth, humming to herself as she traced lines in the dust or sat with the old wooden doll Daniel had carved years ago. The house grew different with their presence, laughter slipping in where silence once ruled, arguments sparking like flint but burning out in shared exhaustion. Yet not all was easy. Thomas distrusted kindness, flinched at comfort, and carried burdens too heavy for his age. He worked until his fingers bled, refusing to admit when he was tired. Ruth, gentle as spring rain, clung to her brother with the fear that if she let go, he might vanish too. Daniel watched, torn between letting them learn their way and stepping in when the weight grew too much. One evening, as the sky bruised purple with dusk, a rider approached the ranch. Daniel spotted him from the porch, a man with a long coat, the kind worn by those who dealt more in other people's pain than their own. The horse moved slow, deliberate, and Daniel's gut tightened. Visitors rarely came with good news. Thomas saw him too and froze, his small hands gripping the fence rail until his knuckles whitened. Ruth, sensing his fear, scurried to Daniel's side. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Even in," the man drawled, his voice smooth but cold. "Heard tell you took in the Clay children." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "Who's askin'?" The man smiled, though it held no warmth. "Name's Carter, friend of their father's, come to see about talkin' what's mine." Thomas's breath hitched, and Ruth clutched Daniel's coat tighter. Daniel felt their fear burn through him like fire, and for the first time in years, his heart beat not for survival but for defense. The promise he had sworn was about to be tested, and there was no turning back. Carter's words hung in the evening air like smoke that refused to clear. Daniel felt the weight of Thomas and Ruth pressed to his side, the boy standing stiff as iron, the girl trembling as though the stranger's voice itself could snatch her away. The man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes had the flat gleam of someone who measured lives in coin, not in blood or breath. Daniel didn't move from the porch. He let the silence stretch, testing the ground between them. He'd learned long ago that some men filled silence with truth, others with deceit. Carter, though, seemed comfortable in it, like a wolf that had learned patience from hunger. "You say you're a friend of their father's." Daniel's voice came steady low as he folded his arms across his chest. "Strange, then, that I never heard of you while Clay was alive." Carter's grin deepened. Not the kind of friend folks talk about over Sunday supper, but close enough to know he owed debts, debts that don't vanish in the grave. Children make fine payment when a man's pockets come up empty. Ruth gasped, burying her face in Daniel's coat. Thomas stepped in front of her, his jaw set, his fists balled, though his small frame shook with fury. "You can't have us," he spat, voice breaking on the last word. Carter chuckled as if the defiance of a child amused him. "Boy, I don't need your permission, the law's on my side. Your pa signed papers, pledged collateral, and here you stand." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, men twisting law into a noose to strangle the weak. He stepped down off the porch, each bootfall measured, deliberate, until he stood eye to eye with Carter. The man smelled of tobacco and dust, of miles ridden with the certainty that no one would bar his way. "You'll ride off," Daniel said, voice like gravel. "Now, these children aren't yours to claim." Carter tilted his head, studying him. "And you ain't kin, just some lonely rancher clutching strays to fill his empty table. Tell me how long before you tire of them." Daniel's hand flexed, aching to reach for the rifle hanging inside the door. But steel wouldn't settle this yet, not while Ruth's tears soaked his coat and Thomas's breath came in ragged, furious gasps. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. "I swore to their mother. That oath stands higher than any paper your hands carry." For the first time, Carter's smile faltered, just slightly. His eyes narrowed, cold fire sparking in their depths. He tugged his gloves tighter, then swung back into the saddle with a fluid motion that spoke of a man too sure of himself to believe he'd lost. "This ain't over," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "Enjoy your little charity, Harlow. I'll be back with proof, with law, and with men who don't take kindly to broken deals." The horse turned, hooves striking sparks against the hard ground as Carter rode off into the falling dusk. Daniel stood watching until the rider disappeared into the tree line, the tension in his frame like a bow strung too tight. Only when the silence returned did he glance back at the children. Thomas's eyes blazed, his young chest heaving. "He's lying. Pa never he would," but the words faltered, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Ruth clung harder, her small body trembling. Daniel crouched, meeting Thomas's gaze. "Listen to me. Whatever your father did, whatever words he signed, none of it makes you property. You hear me? You're not debt, you're not collateral, you're children, and you're mine to protect now." Thomas's lip quivered, the fight in him cracking under the weight of those words. He gave a sharp nod, but his eyes were wet, and he turned away quickly, ashamed of tears he couldn't stop. Daniel let him go, knowing the boy carried more than his shoulders were built for. That night the ranch felt less like refuge and more like a fort under siege. Daniel checked the locks twice, laid his rifle across the table, and banked the fire high. The children lay restless beneath the quilts. Ruth whimpered in her sleep, calling for her mother, while Thomas stared at the ceiling, his young mind chasing fears too big to catch. Daniel sat by the fire, the shadows playing across his lined face. His own ghosts rose with the crackle of the flames, memories of his son, fever taking him in a single brutal week, of his wife's hollowed face when grief became heavier than her body could carry. He had promised himself never again, never to open the door to that kind of hurt. Yet here he was, two small lives clinging to him as if his word alone could hold back the storm. By morning he had made his choice. "Thomas," he said as the boy rubbed sleep from his eyes, "come with me." The boy followed without question, though his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Daniel led him to the barn, where sunlight spilled in golden shafts through the slats. He placed a hammer in Thomas's hand, guiding his fingers around the worn grip. "You want to protect your sister?" Daniel asked. Thomas nodded fiercely. "Then learn to build, to mend, to stand. There's more to strength than fists." Together they worked, mending a broken fence rail, patching tack. Daniel showed him where to strike nails true, how to brace wood against strain. Thomas's arms shook with the effort, sweat beading on his brow, but pride flickered in his eyes with each task finished. For the first time, Daniel saw the boy look not only burdened but also capable. Ruth toddled in later, dragging her doll by the arm. She sat in the hay, humming, her gaze following Daniel like sunlight follows the earth. He found himself softening in those small moments, her giggle when a horse nuzzled her cheek, Thomas's stubborn grin when he finally drove a nail clean through. But always the shadow of Carter lingered. 2 days later word came from town. A peddler stopped by, breathless with gossip. "Harlow, you best be ready. That man Carter, he's stirring folks at the saloon, flashing papers, saying the Clay children belong to him by law. Reckons he's riding back with the marshal come Sunday." The children froze at the words. Ruth clutched her doll to her chest, eyes wide with terror. Thomas's fists clenched so hard his knuckles bled where his nails dug into skin. Daniel dismissed the peddler with a curt nod, but inside, his resolve hardened to steel. Sunday gave him 3 days. 3 days to prepare, 3 days to decide whether to meet Carter with law, with steel, or with something deeper than either. That evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Thomas approached him quietly. "If he takes us," the boy's voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "If he takes us, will you fight?" Daniel looked at him long, then placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and unyielding. "I gave my word, and a man fights hardest when it's for his family." Thomas's eyes glistened, but this time, no shame followed. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since Miriam's last breath, the boy allowed himself to believe he wasn't alone in this fight. The storm was coming. Daniel could feel it in the earth, in the sky, in the weight of every breath. But he had faced storms before, and this time he wasn't facing it alone. The days that followed were long and heavy, as if the sky itself leaned down upon Daniel Harlow's ranch. Clouds bruised the horizon, winds whispered low through the cottonwoods, and every sound seemed to carry more meaning than it should. The children felt it too, Thomas watching the road with narrowed eyes, Ruth clinging to Daniel's sleeve whenever the horses stirred. They knew a reckoning was coming, even if they could not name its shape. Daniel rose before dawn each morning, as he always had, but there was a different tension in the rhythm of his chores. He worked with the intensity of a man preparing ground for battle rather than planting. The fences were repaired twice over, the barn secured, the rifle oiled until it gleamed in the light of the fire. Thomas shadowed him with stubborn devotion, mirroring each task, his face tight with concentration. He drove nails, carried buckets, and practiced swinging the hatchet with small, determined arms. Daniel corrected him quietly, never mocking his clumsy strikes, because he recognized in the boy a heart hardened by grief but not yet broken. Ruth followed too, though her hands were too small to carry tools. She sang softly to her doll, sometimes whispering words Daniel couldn't catch. But when she tripped on the porch and scraped her knee, she bit back tears with a ferocity that startled him. When he bent to lift her, she shook her head stubbornly, insisting she could stand. In her tiny defiance, Daniel saw Miriam's eyes, eyes that had pleaded for her children to be carried forward, not coddled. On the third day, the air itself seemed to pause. Even the birds grew quiet. Daniel felt the weight in his bones before the sound reached his ears, hooves, steady and measured, drawing closer. Ruth darted to the window, her small face pale as she peered out. "He's coming," she whispered. Daniel set his jaw, reaching for the rifle propped by the door. Thomas stood at his side, fists clenched, his breath quick. Daniel glanced down, then laid a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "You stay behind me, no matter what happens." The riders came into view as the sun slanted across the valley. Carter led them, his coat dark as tar, his hat pulled low. Beside him rode two men Daniel didn't recognize, hard-eyed, armed faces cut from the same cloth as trouble. And behind them, unmistakable in the way he sat straight-backed in the saddle, came the town marshal, his badge glinting in the fading light. Daniel stepped onto the porch, rifle held steady though not yet raised. Carter reined in first, his grin slick as oil. "Afternoon, Harlow, I said I'd be back. Brought company this time, lawful company." The marshal dismounted, dusting off his coat as though reluctant to be here. He held a roll of papers in his hand, bound with twine. "Daniel," he said, his tone low but firm, "there's claim here. Man named Clay signed collateral for debts. Children pledged as wardship should he default. Carter here owns that note." Thomas let out a strangled sound, half a cry, half a growl. "He's lying. Pa he wouldn't sell us." His young voice cracked, but he pressed forward as though sheer will could undo the words. The marshal's eyes softened, but he didn't deny it. "Papers signed, boy. Whether your pa meant it or not, law binds it." Ruth whimpered, clutching at Daniel's coat. "Don't let him take us," she begged, her tiny voice breaking with desperation. Daniel stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on gravel. He stood tall, rifle in his grip, his frame blocking the doorway where the children hid. "Marshal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of stone, "law may bind paper, but I gave my oath. That woman, Miriam Clay, she spent her last breath asking me to protect her children. My word stands higher than Carter's greed." Carter laughed loud and mocking. "Pretty speeches don't pay debts, Harlow. You think your solemn face and your rifle scare me. The law's on my side. You'll hand them over or you'll hang for defiance." The marshal shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. "Daniel, don't make this worse. You know I'm bound to uphold what's writ." Daniel's eyes never left Carter. Sometimes what's writ ain't what's right. The words hung heavy. Thomas stepped out onto the porch despite Daniel's command, his small chest heaving. "We're not his," he shouted, his voice breaking with fury. "We're not anybody's but ours." His thin frame trembled, but his fists clenched, his eyes blazing with a fire too fierce for his years. For a moment silence, then Carter's grin faltered. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Marshal, do your duty, take the brats." The marshal hesitated. He looked at Daniel, then at the boy standing tall though tears streaked his face. His jaw tightened. "I ain't dragging children off like livestock," he said at last, his tone sharp. "If Carter wants them, he can claim them himself." Carter's face darkened, fury flashing across his features. He dismounted, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. "So be it," he hissed. "Step aside, Harlow." Daniel leveled the rifle in a single, fluid motion, the barrel steady, his eyes hard. One more step and you'll regret it. The tension snapped taut as a rope pulled too tight. The men beside Carter shifted, their hands hovering near their guns. Ruth sobbed softly behind Daniel, her small body trembling. Thomas stood frozen, torn between fear and defiance. Then the sky split with thunder, not from clouds, but from hooves. A dozen riders crested the ridge, dust billowing behind them. At their lead rode a figure Daniel hadn't expected, a rancher from 3 valleys over, flanked by men whose faces Daniel recognized from long years of quiet acquaintance. They rode hard, grim determination written in every line of their frames. Carter spun, his face paling as the riders drew closer. "What's this?" he snarled. The lead rider pulled up, his voice carrying over the wind. "Word spread, Carter. Folks won't stomach you taking children on a crooked debt. You try, you'll face all of us." The men behind him nodded, their presence heavy as iron. For the first time, Carter's certainty faltered. His eyes darted to the marshal, then back to Daniel, who stood unflinching with the rifle steady in his grip. Behind him, Thomas and Ruth clung together, their small bodies trembling, their future hanging by the thinnest thread. The standoff stretched, each heartbeat louder than thunder. Then Carter spat into the dust, fury twisting his face. "This ain't finished," he growled. "You think you've won, but debts don't disappear. I'll be back." He swung into the saddle, snapping the reins. His men followed, their retreat leaving only dust and bitter silence behind. The marshal let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "Daniel, you've bought time, maybe more, but Carter's the kind that festers. He'll circle back." Daniel lowered the rifle slowly, his gaze drifting to the children. Thomas's face was streaked with tears, but pride shone in his eyes. Ruth pressed close, her tiny voice trembling. "We don't have to go." Daniel knelt, pulling them both into his arms. His voice came low but steady, like stone carved by years of storm. "You're mine now, and no man alive will change that." The children clung to him, their sobs breaking into his chest, while the sun dipped behind the ridge and shadows lengthened across the land. But for the first time since Miriam's last breath, Daniel felt something stir in the silence, something fierce, unyielding, and alive. Family. The nights after Carter's retreat felt thinner, like a skin stretched too taut over bone. Every creak in the house sounded like a step on the road to trouble. Days carried work and a fragile normal, the routines that stitch a life back together after loss. Thomas rose with first light and worked until the sun dipped low, his arms growing calloused, his face hardening with responsibility. Ruth learned to fetch water and carry kindling, her small hands steadying under the weight of tasks that should not have belonged to her. Daniel watched them in the quiet hours between chores, cataloging the tiny victories. A laugh that lingered past a moment, a night when Ruth did not wake crying, a meal eaten without a glance toward the door as if every shadow might be a stranger. He taught Thomas how to read the land, where the soil ran thin and where the water pooled in hidden hollows. He taught him to tend the animals, to coax a stubborn colt into step, to tell whether a cough in the herd was sickness or just the winter's scratch. There were moments when Daniel thought the worst of the hollow in his chest had finally begun to scar over, when the house held warmth not just in the fire, but in the small pulse of 2 new lives learning their place there. Word from town softened the edge of fear into something manageable. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles wrapped in cloth and kind eyes that waited for thanks but did not demand it. Old man Grady left extra feed for the horses and a wink that said he'd ride out if Carter came again. The butcher from the next valley traded meat for a day's work and a promise that Daniel would call if trouble brewed. Folks muttered at the tavern and at the market. Carter had rubbed more than one man the wrong way. But men who dealt in debt and collaterals find pockets of darkness to hide in, and tongues cannot always chase them out. Still, the presence of neighbors, the slow migration of company that began when one soul decided to stand, gave Daniel a brittle comfort. He traded the quiet he'd always prized for a watchfulness that belonged to a man who had learned a promise could become a fight. Thomas took to walking the ridge in the evenings, scanning the line of pines toward the west as though the horizon itself might carry an answer to what would come. He practiced shooting with the old rifle until Daniel's stern voice told him to stop and rest his shoulder. He learned the dignity of steady aim and the humility of admitting when he missed. At night, he sat on the porch with his knees drawn up and told Daniel stories about his mother, snatches of memory, Miriam humming as she mended a sleeve, the way she sang nonsense rhymes to Ruth until the little girl laughed in a way that made the house feel less empty. Daniel listened and supplied small, steady replies, questions that let Thomas walk his memories instead of being dragged by them. The boy's grief was a thing Daniel could not take from him, but he could hold the space where the boy might set it down and breathe. Ruth grew into the house with the careful curiosity of a child who knows the value of small things. She learned to plant seeds, to press dirt over them and whisper encouraging nonsense as if the earth would answer. She would sit for hours at the hearth and watch Daniel work with leather, his hands moving in the slow, sure motions of a man who made much out of little. Once she slipped her small hand into his while he stitched a torn strap. The touch was a brief, bright thing, an exchange that carried more meaning than either of them could name. Daniel folded it into himself like a map, the lines of it guiding him through nights when he could not sleep because the world felt like a ledger ledgered against mercy. Despite the slow building of daily life, the threat of Carter remained a dark tide at the edge of everything. He had not gone quietly from their thoughts. Instead, he schemed in the corners where men who thirst for advantage brew plans. Carter's visits to the saloon had turned from bravado to venom. His calls to the marshal became a steady drumbeat, and friends he had once bought with favors or money gathered in whispers that promised a return. Daniel kept his ear to those whispers and his hand near the rifle. He leaned on allies when they offered and refused when a friend suggested payback with blood more eagerly than a talk. The line Daniel drew was simple. He would not be the one to start killing for a promise, but he would defend those in his charge with everything he had. Then came the letter, a crude thing, paper rough as sand and sealed with a smear of ink that might have been a name. It arrived on the wings of dusk, brought by a writer who would not meet Daniel's eye. The words inside were thin and clean and meant to cut. Remove the children from Harlow property by dawn of the next third day, or lose what you hold dear. No signature, only the sense of a man who never touched a door without thinking of the rope he might string for another. Daniel folded the paper slowly, each crease learning the shape of a threat. He called the neighbors, no point hiding the danger under the bed. Danger grows teeth when it is secret. Men came, Grady with his lantern and a heavy stick, the butcher with his steady presence, 2 ranch hands from the next valley who had owed Daniel a favor in the old days. They stood by him in a council that had the bare lines of battle planning, more watchmen at night, traps for rustlers, hidden saddles tethered for a quick ride. The women of the valley planned quietly too, teaching Ruth how to fold dress hems in ways that made them hard to pick apart in a scuffle, showing Thomas the best way to tuck a note into a boot where only he could find it. Preparations were comfort as much as it was precaution. The barn was made tidy and secure, animals were moved closer to the house, and Daniel set watch rotations in a small book that had once belonged to his father. He showed Thomas how to move in the dark, how to listen for the whisper of hooves rather than the heavy talk of men. They practiced until the boy's muscles remembered what the mind feared. Ruth learned where to hide if the house was breached, a narrow crawlspace beneath the pantry where she could curl into a ball and be a thing impossible to see. Their small world was wrapped in a web of plans and reassurances, a net Daniel hoped would catch whatever attempt Carter could make. For a while it seemed to be enough. Days flowed into a slow steadiness. Carter's men, perhaps calculating or perhaps cowed by the community's quiet resolve, did not press their luck. Rumors reached them. Carter's words were costing him allies. Men did not want to be tangled in a fight over 2 children that could sour their own days. Daniel let the small measure of peace comfort him. Though he never slept more than an hour at a time, his eyes always awake to the faintest sound. He had learned that a calm sky often broke first. When the clouds looked most forgiving, the storm could be the most treacherous. And then, on a night when the moon hid behind a skin of thin cloud, and the wind seemed lulled into a hush, the worst of his fears came to life. It started with a smell. Daniel was awake, he always was, but the scent of smoke hit him like a fist before the children's cries could reach him. He moved without thinking, boots finding the floor, hands fumbling for the lamp. Ruth's small voice broke the dark. "Fire!" she screamed, voice small and terrified, and Thomas's call came like a blade, raw and high. The house filled with light and choking heat in a way that left Daniel's mind half blind. He grabbed the rifle because his hands were used to holding it more than axes in moments of panic. But the real thing he needed was water, breath, a way to wring smoke from lungs. They ran into the yard where the night tasted of ash. Flames bit at the eaves of the barn, an angry, lapping thing that loved the dry wood. The stall walls were already blackening, and with every heartbeat the fire ate more. Horses whinnied and thrashed. One frantic mare had flailed loose of her tether, hooves churning dirt as she sought someplace untouched by heat. Daniel's lungs narrowed with the metallic tang of panic. Men were already pouring from neighboring houses, lanterns swinging, voices jagged with alarm. Grady hauled a bucket. The butcher passed a pail, his hands working with animal calm that had steadied many a bad night. Thomas moved like a shadow in the confusion, his small face set, and Ruth clung to him, her fingers digging into his sleeve as if holding the thread that kept her tethered to safety. They fought the blaze in a blur, buckets passing, coats beating at the flames, hands scorched raw even through cloth. For a time hope burned with them. They drove back a tongue of flame from the hayloft and laughed in a choking, tired way that they had won that small fight. Daniel felt relief press into him like a warm hand until a cry rang out, a sound that punched through the madness and made the world spin. It was a woman's voice, thin with horror, calling out from the far side of the barn. "The foal, he's gone." Someone had left a stall door unlatched, or a mare had panicked and kicked a latch open. The colt that had been due to bond with the mare only a week hence had been stolen in the confusion, or had bolted into the black trees and not returned. The loss bit like salt. That animal had been practical, a future helper, a measure of security. The theft was more than material. It was an attack on the fragile scaffolding of their lives. Daniel's chest closed around anger then, a raw thing. He barked orders, sent men racing into the dark for the missing animal, and searched the outer fences where prints might be gathered. Then, as if the night intended to disrespect the work they had done to keep life intact, an even deeper cut revealed itself. At the foot of the barn's scorched threshold, half burned and curled like something that had been stepped on and forgotten, lay a doll, Ruth's doll. Its face was blackened around one cheek, one button eye melted into a hollow, the yarn hair singed to a stub. For a second the world narrowed to that small, charred thing. Ruth launched herself forward, the loss a fresh, brutal thing she could not hold in. She reached for the doll, her fingers closing around its ruined body, and sobs tore from her small chest like something raw. Thomas fell to his knees beside her, hands splayed in the dirt where the doll had been. His small shoulders shook with a sound that was not just grief but a recognition, that someone had come through their life and touched what was dear just to prove they could. Daniel crouched close, the smoke making his eyes sting, and the anger inside him rose in slow, lethal heat. Someone had not merely threatened them on paper. Someone had come for them under cover of night and taken what they held close enough to burn. The men returned without the foal. Footprints led away into the shadow of the tree line, prints that were too neat, too deliberate, like a man who wanted his work to be seen and his message understood. Carter's style, Daniel thought, bitter and cold. It was meant to say, "We can reach you. We can leave wounds that are small and personal and that ache forever." Daniel felt the promise he'd made to Miriam transform into a blade he had to wield, not just a word he had spoken. He pulled Thomas close, wrapping his arm around the boy who was no longer merely a helper on the ranch but a ward under his protection. Ruth clung between them, her breath sharp and quick, eyes wide and empty, seeming as if a husk had been removed from something that had once been whole. Hands gripped Daniel's shoulder. Grady's voice, rough and urgent in the smoke, said, "You want to ride after them tonight?" There was a line in the question, a demand and a plea all folded into one. Daniel's jaw worked. He could ride, chase the footprints, hunt the men who had stolen an animal and torched a barn like it was a message. He could unspool a string of violence that might answer violence in kind. Or he could stay and see to what remained, put out embers that might flare again, gather children to safety, tend to those whose hands were blistered and raw. He thought of Miriam's last breath, of his promise to hold her children, and of the long, thorny road that had already worn him thin. He knew violence could solve some immediate problem, but it made new ghosts where none had been before. Still, the open air of the night called to him, an animal cry that would not be ignored. Before he could decide, a new sound curled out of the trees and made every man still. Horses galloping hard, nearer than a man would expect for a lone rustler returned to his bed. Lanterns bobbed into view as riders came up the lane, faces Daniel recognized and some he did not. At their lead, dismounted and running like a man who had seen worse than flames, was the marshal. He was not alone, but his voice when he called out carried the thin edge of alarm. "Harlow." "There's more tracks 15 minutes past the ridge. 2 riders, then 4, then a whole string of prints. Folks say they saw them head east toward the Badlands. And there's a note tied to a post by the old rock. Said you'd be next if you don't hand the children over by dawn." He held out a scrap of paper wet with smoke. The same thin cruelty coated the lines. Daniel's knuckles whitened as he took it. The note was precise, a razor of intent. Last chance. Give them up by dawn or blood answers blood. The world seemed to tilt beneath Daniel. The measure of threat had escalated from theft to an attempt at terror meant to loosen resolve. They had burned a barn and stolen a foal to show they could touch what Daniel held dear. Now they wanted to make him choose between his oath and the safety of those he loved. Around him voices rose, hot and frightened, but Daniel heard only the rhythm of his heartbeat and the small breaths of the children near him. He had sworn to Miriam. He had promised to keep these 2 alive and safe. Promises had the weight of mountains in them when you were the only thing between someone and the dark. He looked up at the tree line, at the black beyond the lantern halo where men could hide and wait, and he made a decision that tasted of iron and home. He would not hand over the children. He would not barter their lives to buy a hollow peace. If violence was the path laid before them, then they would walk it together, with eyes open and boots ready. He turned to the small cluster of neighbors and friends, men and women who had come at the smell of fire and the sound of hands, and he spoke, low and clear, the kind of voice that pulls men's courage like a rope. "We hold until dawn," he said. "We watch and we stand together. If they come to steal what's ours, they'll take us all." No one spoke at first, but one by one the men nodded, and the women's faces drew hard with the resolve of those who would protect hearth and child at any cost. The fire still smoked. The barn's blackened throat coughed a melancholy that would take long to heal. Thomas tightened his grip on the melted doll, his knuckles white, and Ruth hid her face in Daniel's coat, her breath ragged but alive. As night settled again over the ranch, a tension like wire hummed in the air. Lanterns were set at intervals. Men took positions behind fence posts and under trees. The neighbors' voices were a thin murmur at the edges, a prayer clothed in planning. Daniel sat with the rifle across his lap, the weight of it a small, familiar comfort against the sudden hollow where fear tried to take root. He had made a promise, and now his promise might demand everything from him, sweat, blood, or more. He did not know which. He only knew the faces of the 2 children sleeping in the next room under quilts that smelled faintly of smoke and bread. He had vowed to protect them, and no amount of paper or threats would break that vow without men and women paid in courage to stand in the breach. The night stretched long and thin, each hour a slow tick of the world waiting for what would happen at dawn or before. Somewhere beyond the rings of lantern light, men moved in the dark, making choices of their own. Daniel listened to their breathing, to the creak of the porch, to Ruth's small, even sleep sounds that kept him tethered to the single truth of his life now, the promise. He tightened his hands around the rifle and prayed, not the loud prayers of those who hope to be saved, but the short, private ones a man mutters between his teeth when the night comes to test him. Dawn would bring a choice from those who had sent the note. Dawn might bring a fight, or it might bring a silence that meant retreat. Either way, the promise weighed heavy in him, and he would not break it. The night bled slow, each hour stretched thin as a wire pulled taut across a canyon. Daniel Harlow sat with his rifle across his knees, his back against the porch post, eyes fixed on the black horizon. The lanterns threw thin circles of light, enough to make the shadows dance but never enough to settle them. Around him, neighbors kept watch in shifts, their faces pale in the glow, voices hushed as though the darkness might overhear. Somewhere inside, the children slept fitfully, their dreams surely tangled with fire and threat, their small bodies curled into quilts that still carried the faint scent of smoke. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind through the cottonwoods made Daniel's hand tighten on the rifle stock. He thought often of Miriam in those hours, her pale face on the cot, the weight of her grip when she'd whispered for him to promise. He had thought he understood the cost of that vow then, but promises always carry debts of their own. Tonight, the debt felt closer, as if payment would be demanded before the sun broke over the ridge. Around midnight, Thomas crept out onto the porch, his eyes wide but steady. He held himself like a boy trying to wear a man's frame, shoulders squared, chin lifted, though the fear behind his eyes betrayed him. He carried nothing but a blanket wrapped around him, but he stood beside Daniel as if his presence alone could add strength to the watch. "You should be asleep," Daniel murmured, his voice quiet enough not to wake the others. "I couldn't." Thomas's reply was hoarse but sure. He looked out at the black line of trees, his jaw tight. "What if they come now? What if they come when we're not ready?" Daniel studied him for a long moment. The boy's face was sharp with youth, but the lines of grief had carved themselves deep, older than any child deserved. He reached over, laying a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Fear don't make you weak, it makes you ready. Remember that." Thomas nodded, his small hands tightening around the blanket. "I won't let them take Ruth, I swear it." Daniel's throat ached at the fierceness in his voice. "That's my promise, boy. Yours is to live, to hold on no matter what. You hear?" Thomas looked up at him, eyes bright with something that was not quite tears but close. He nodded again, this time slower, as if committing it to his marrow. They stood in silence together, two figures on a porch against the wide emptiness of night, bound by promises that felt heavier than any gun. The hours crept on. Some neighbors dozed against posts, their rifles resting across their laps. The marshal, who had refused to return to town despite his uneasy loyalties, paced slow circles, his eyes never leaving the dark. At one point, Ruth cried out in her sleep, and Daniel half rose, his chest twisting at the sound, but Thomas slipped back inside to soothe her, returning a few minutes later with her small doll clutched tight in his hand. The sight of that charred toy, singed hair, melted eye, lit a slow fire in Daniel's gut. It was a reminder that their enemies did not just want to win, they wanted to wound. Just before dawn, the stillness broke. The sound was faint at first, hoofbeats, too steady to be accident, too many to be a lone traveler. Daniel straightened, rifle rising to his shoulder before the others had even caught the rhythm. He counted in his head, 4, no 6 horses, maybe more. The ground seemed to hum with their approach. "Riders," Daniel said flatly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Men rose from their posts, rifles lifted, jaws tight. Grady's lantern swung once before he doused it, plunging the yard into deeper shadow. Better to see than be seen. The children's window glowed faintly from a candle Ruth had begged for, but Daniel's chest seized with fear and he gestured sharply for Thomas to put it out. The boy ran, and the flame winked dark. The hoofbeats drew closer until the shapes of riders emerged from the tree line, black against the first pale light of dawn. There were 8 of them, their horses snorting in the cold, their faces shadowed under hats pulled low. Carter rode at their head, his coat flaring behind him, his smile a pale slash even in the dim. "Well now," he called, his voice carrying easy in the still air. "Thought maybe you'd come to your senses, Harlow, but here we are. Last chance, hand over the brats, and we'll let your barn be the only thing that burns." Daniel stepped forward, rifle raised, his voice as steady as stone. "You're not taking them." Carter chuckled, shaking his head as if at a stubborn child. "You think a promise means more than a man's debts. Think your word can outgun mine. You'll bleed for this, Harlow. You and anyone fool enough to stand with you." The riders spread slightly, the threat clear in the shifting of their hands toward holsters. The neighbors bristled, rifles steady, though Daniel saw the tremor in one man's grip. The marshal called out sharply, his tone edged with authority but also desperation. "Carter, you push this, it'll be blood in the dirt. You willing to hang for children that ain't yours?" Carter spat into the dust, eyes never leaving Daniel. "Better men than me have hung, Marshal, and worse men have walked free. I'll take my chances." The standoff tightened like a noose. Horses shifted, men breathed shallow, fingers hovered. Thomas clutched Ruth behind the door, peering out with eyes too wide, too aware. Daniel felt the weight of every breath, every second. He thought of Miriam's last plea, of his own children's graves, of the silence that had filled his cabin for too many years. He thought of the fire and the doll, of Ruth's tiny hand in his, of Thomas's fierce jaw when he swore he'd protect her. All of it burned through him, leaving only the hard edge of resolve. He spoke low, but the words cut through the dawn like steel. "If you want them, Carter, you'll have to walk over me." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Carter's grin snapped sharp, his hand flashing to his gun. The crack of gunfire split the morning, loud and violent. Horses reared, men shouted. The neighbors fired back in a sudden storm of sound and smoke. Daniel's rifle bucked against his shoulder, his aim true, sending one of Carter's men tumbling from his saddle with a cry. The yard became chaos, hooves striking, guns roaring, the acrid sting of powder filling the air. Through it all, Daniel moved like a man forged for this single moment. He fired, reloaded, fired again, each shot measured, deliberate. His body remembered violence even when his heart had long tried to forget. Carter's men pressed hard, but the defenders stood firmer than he expected. One neighbor fell with a cry, clutching his arm, but another stepped forward to cover him. For every bullet that whined past Daniel's ear, he sent one back with deadly purpose. Carter himself hung back, eyes cold, calculating. He shouted orders, spurring his men forward, but his smile was gone. Twice Daniel saw him raise his gun, and twice Carter lowered it before firing, as though unwilling to risk a shot unless he knew it would end the fight. Minutes dragged like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attackers faltered. One man lay dead in the dust, 2 others wounded and groaning. The defenders had held, their line unbroken. Carter snarled, wheeling his horse back, fury etched deep into his face. "This isn't over, Harlow," he bellowed over the chaos. "You think you've won, but I'll come again. I'll come until those brats are mine." With that, he spurred his horse, his remaining men scrambling after him. The thunder of their retreat echoed through the valley until it faded into silence, leaving only the smoke, the groans of the wounded, and the heavy beat of Daniel's heart. The neighbors slowly lowered their rifles, the air thick with exhaustion and disbelief. The marshal knelt by the fallen man, checking his wounds, then looked up at Daniel with eyes weary but resolute. "You held," he said simply. Daniel stood in the yard, rifle still in his hands, his chest heaving. Thomas rushed to him, Ruth in tow, both of them throwing their arms around his waist with a desperation that nearly buckled his knees. He dropped the rifle at last, wrapping them close, his voice rough as gravel. "You're safe," he whispered, though his eyes burned with the knowledge that safety was only a fragile thing. "You're safe for now." And as the sun finally crested the ridge, spilling light across the battered ranch, Daniel knew the fight was far from over. Promises once made did not end with a single battle. They demanded more, and Carter's shadow still lingered, waiting for the next chance to strike. And in that quiet, with the porch light spilling low and warm, Daniel Harlow finally allowed himself to believe the thing he had sworn long ago. That promises, if kept with stubborn hands and an honest heart, can remake a life, not in grand gestures but in meals shared, in chairs carved, in apple trees planted, and in the steady habit of showing up for the small people who need someone to stand with them. The valley would keep its memories of the night the barn burned, and of the mean man who chased paper and not souls. The children, the neighbors, and even the law would move on as seasons move on. But the promise would remain.